The weather was tens of degrees below freezing, and gale-force winds buffeted the two mountain climbers, both members of a mountain search and rescue team. The men were now attempting to summit New Zealand's tallest peak, Mount Cook. Yet their many years of experience rescuing others off dangerous peaks told them that it would now be them who needed rescue. With nightfall coming, the men knew there was only one chance for survival. They had to dig themselves a shelter and ride out the worst of the weather. With climbing picks and survival axes in hand, the two men began to hack away at the snow and ice, digging through increasingly worsening weather, knowing that their lives were on the line. The next day, and at the foot of the mountain, the two climbers had failed to check in. Don Bogey, one of New Zealand's senior-most mountaineers and search and rescue professionals, wasn't worried. He knew the two men, Mark Ingalls and Phil Dooley, and he knew that they were capable and experienced climbers. Besides, he himself had to spend the night on the mountain before, snowed in by bad weather. As long as they could find shelter, they could ride out even the worst of sudden storms. Back up the mountain, Ingalls and Dooley had both dug several feet into the snow and ice, digging out an ice cave in which to shelter. Because snow is such a good insulator, the cave helped trap their body heat, but the men had no wood or other material with which to start a fire. Their only source of heat was their sleeping bags and own body heat. With the temperatures steadily dropping and storm not seeming to let up, worry began to gnaw at the back of the men's minds. Already an icy chill gripped them, and even laying in their sleeping bags fully clothed wasn't enough to keep the cold at bay. To make matters worse, the men had only brought enough food and supplies for a few days' trek. They decided that they should start to ration, having no idea when the storm could let up. The men knew that storms on Mount Cook could be unpredictable, and the storm may break tomorrow or not let up for a week or more. Stretching out what food supplies they had would be vital. On such reduced rations, though, their bodies struggled to generate heat, which only worsened the situation very quickly, taking a turn for the disastrous. A few days later, Bogey was now extremely concerned. The storm blasting Mount Cook had not abated at all. Gale-force winds blasted the peaks and sides of the various approaches up Mount Cook, and anyone caught out in the open up there would not last long at all. Bogey held out hope that the men had found shelter, but he knew that the situation was very quickly turning grim. If the weather didn't break soon, they might have to send a search and rescue party out looking for corpses, not survivors. Thankfully though, the next day the weather cleared enough for a helicopter to start the search attempt. Bogey immediately volunteered to lead the search and rescue effort, and with good reason. Of New Zealand's search and rescue personnel, he was the most experienced at strop rescues, when the rescuers flown in a harness by a long tether at the bottom of the helicopter. The technique is incredibly dangerous and requires careful communication between the rescuer and the pilot, as well as nerves of steel for both. Unable to see below his aircraft, the pilot had to rely on verbal instructions from the rescuer on where to descend and how fast, or else the pilot may accidentally smash the rescuer into the side of a mountain. Yet with no hope of landing the helicopter anywhere on the steep sides of Mount Cook, Bogey knew that this was the only way of rescuing the trapped men. Until the men's location was found though, Bogey would ride inside the chopper, eyes glued to his binoculars as he and the pilot scoured the slopes for the missing men. In their gusto to find the climbers though, they were forced to take unsafe risks, once nearly crashing into a ridge when gusts of wind blew their chopper off course. The weather was still ferocious, and the helicopter was struggling to retain control. It was unsafe for the rescuers, and yet Bogey and the pilot accepted the risk, knowing that they were the only chance that Ingalls and Dooley had for survival. Ignoring the many close calls and the danger, the chopper scoured the slopes, working by process of elimination and checking out huts and other places the men may be sheltering. Back in the ice cave, Ingalls and Dooley knew that they were in trouble. Severe frostbite had already affected them in their extremities, and both knew that they were going to be losing toes to amputation if they managed to return to civilization. Day by day though, the chill grew ever higher up their legs. The extreme cold was limiting blood flow to their legs, and slowly, from the feet up, their legs were freezing and dying. Eventually the chill would reach their torso, where it would be fatal. Food supplies were down to very meager rations, and with such low energy their bodies struggled to generate enough heat to survive. Yet from time to time, the men could hear the sound of a helicopter, unfortunately distant, but gradually working its way toward their location. The sound of possible rescue kept the men's spirits up, a fact that more than anything likely led to their ultimate survival. As any survival expert will tell you, when hope dies, the body is quick to follow. For days now, Bogey had been scouring the mountain by helicopter looking for the two stranded men. Then suddenly the weather broke enough to allow the helicopter to ascend to an area known as the Middle Peak. Taking the opportunity, the helicopter battled fierce winds and made the ascent. And as soon as they cleared the low clouds, Bogey was surprised to see the two men right there, waving up at him from below. The helicopter could not land, however, and Bogey would have to be strapped into his rescue harness dangling below the helicopter back down at the base, then be flown all the way back. The weather was still far too dangerous for this, and thus rescue would still have to wait. Instead, Bogey dropped the men down food, medical supplies, and a working radio so they could keep in contact. Grateful for the food, the men tore at the emergency rations, boosting their rapidly plummeting internal temperatures. The radio helped the men bolster their fading spirits as well, and jokingly, the men told their rescuers that they had settled into an ice cave that they dubbed the Middle Peak Hotel. Spirits and humor were still clearly up, giving hope to the rescuers that the men could be reached before they succumbed to the cold. Unfortunately though, the weather refused to cooperate, and storms once more battered the area. The radio battery quickly died, cutting off contact between the men and the rest of the world. Days passed, and at last the weather cleared enough for an Air Force helicopter to make the ascent up the peak. On its way up though, the helicopter hit dangerous turbulence, spinning it out of control and crashing it upside down onto an ice shelf a few hours' climb away from the men. Inside the upside-down chopper, 4 rescuers and 3 Air Force personnel pulled themselves out of the wreck. Having received only minor wounds, incredibly, the tail of the chopper hung right off a precipitous fall, and the occupants of the helicopter had avoided a several thousand-foot fall to their deaths by mere inches. A rescue for the trapped crew was immediately launched, but this tied up the only other remaining chopper, and the weather window to rescue the climbers closed. The next day, the weather remained relatively calm, and Don Bogey made up his mind. Today was it. They couldn't afford to wait another day, or he feared the men would die, and there was no telling if the weather would give them another opportunity. Despite conditions being less than optimal, Bogey strapped himself into his harness, and the helicopter slowly began its climb up the mountain, with Bogey hanging 100 feet below it on a tether. A disaster like with the Air Force helicopter would mean his certain death. Unknown to Bogey, it's very likely that Ingalls and Dooley would have in fact not lasted another day. Ingalls' frostbite was so bad that he could no longer stand, and Dooley was having trouble staying on his feet. Luckily for the duo though, after a few hours battling the winds and weather, the helicopter reached them, and slowly Bogey was lowered onto the small ice shelf where the men were sheltering. Dooley happily greeted Bogey, but informed him that Ingalls could no longer walk. With great trepidation, Bogey told the pilot over the radio to give him several meters of slack on the tether, allowing Bogey to crawl into the ice cave and pull out Ingalls, who was still wrapped up in his sleeping bag. This was incredibly dangerous, as if the chopper needed to quickly rise or move due to winds, it would rip Bogey out of the cave and likely kill him in the process. Bogey, however, managed to drag Ingalls out and hook him up to a bag-like stretcher. Dooley would have to wait for his rescue, and Bogey and Ingalls were both lifted up into the air and then lowered down the mountain. With Dooley's position fixed, Bogey and the chopper quickly returned and successfully rescued him as well. The two men would survive their ordeal, though they would require amputations of both their legs due to severe frostbite. The men received prosthetic limbs and incredibly would continue climbing. Mark Ingalls would later become the first double amputee to summit Mount Everest. For his heroics, Don Bogey would be awarded membership to the New Zealand Order of Merit, in honor of his heroic accomplishment and determination in saving the two mountaineers' lives. Think you would ever climb a mountain? How would you survive for 2 weeks on the side of a mountain? What would you do to pass the time? Let us know in the comments, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great content.